Mid Michigan, and a bunch of folks I see from not Ann Arbor, Detroit, of course. Welcome to the 33rd monthly A2NewTech Meetup. Woo! So in case it's your first time here, this is not our standard format. What we don't normally do is the third Tuesday of every month, we have 5 new startups that typically the community's never seen before come and introduce themselves to the community, followed up with networking. And it's a great time, it's a great event, but we're shooting that format tonight to have a very special guest come and present. He's come actually all the way from Silicon Valley, where he's actually the guru of customer development. He's basically spent the last 2 days actually working with U of M's folks on their entrepreneurial program, because he also teaches at Stanford, Berkeley, and Columbia on the topic of entrepreneurship. Our event is sponsored tonight by University of Michigan Tech Transfer Department, University of Michigan's Zeller Institute and Entrepreneurship and Venture Capital Club, as well as A2B's, which supports Ann Arbor's tech culture and community. So without further ado, I'd go and introduce our guest speaker tonight, Steve.
So I'm glad to be back in Ann Arbor. I remind people that the University of Michigan is the best school I was ever thrown out of. And so when I told my friends in California I was coming out to Michigan in the winter, their eyes got really large, and I just reminded them it was like taco, except you didn't have to pay. And there was no snow. There was no mountain either. But it was just like, but I had it close. So I came and I did remember what winter was like. So I'm going to give a talk tonight, which is new rules for the new internet bubble. Just as a reminder, some of you might know I did, before I started teaching, I did 8 startups in 20-some odd years, which proved only a couple things. One is I have attention deficit disorder. And then 2 is, among some of the wins, I have 2 craters so deep they left their own iridium layer. So, it's not all been successes, and I think, was it Nietzsche who said that which does not kill you makes you stronger? It's kind of hard to remember that, when you're hitting the ground, but keep that in mind. Some of you might know I read a blog, steveblank.com. I only pointed out because if you want to know what some failure stories look like, they're there. There are categories on the left. You got to kind of pick them out. But also, I've done some work on customer development since I wrote this text for us, the epiphany. But my thinking since then is also on the blog, and I kind of share my thoughts. About 10 years ago, I started sketching on napkin this diagram, which I'll talk about a bit later, and I called it customer development. In the last 4 or 5 years, I threw a cover on it called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, and you can clearly tell I came up with the cover at 4 in the morning because no one else would put this on the cover. It was actually banned in North Dakota. No, truly. The professor said, well, I'd like to use your text, but we need a cover on it. I said, you've got to be joking. Doesn't anybody go to the Sistine Chapel? And they said, what's that? Okay. All right, now I'm going to be teaching this in North Dakota. And a few people have read it in some bizarre places. This was the winner of the best photo reading book story. The talk is based on a couple of texts. Given that you're all entrepreneurs, the irony is the book you may have is the one in the middle, but the one you really need is the one on the left. Alexander Osterwalder's Business Model Generation book is a key addition to your bookshelf. I know most people now use Kindles. I think if anybody's looking for a startup idea, you should make spines with cliff notes in between. So, when you graduate from school or you want people to understand you've read a lot of stuff, you can't just show them your Kindle. So I think you want to make big spines. That's a startup idea. The premise of this talk is that we're at the beginning of another tech bubble, and that eventually it's starting to show up in Silicon Valley, a little bit in New York, and eventually I think it's going to come to Michigan as well. The rules are different than a bubble, and so what I want to share with you is what are some of these new rules that I think you're going to be seeing in the next year or two And how do they differ from what we did before? So one of the things I thought I'd share before I even get into that talk is defining what a startup is. Now, it might seem like a silly thing to do, but after 20 years of doing startups, I was convinced I knew what one was. It was just the stuff I had done. But the minute I started teaching, I would step into someone else's classroom to see what they were saying, and I realized I didn't recognize the darn thing they were saying. And then it dawned on me that the definition of a startup and who's an entrepreneur was completely different from professor to professor, and even more so, completely different once you got out of technology clusters like Silicon Valley, Michigan, or New York. Completely different. What we think of startups is not actually generally accepted, and let me tell you why. You know, my parents were immigrants. They came to the United States in steerage, passed on their Statue of Liberty, landed in Ellis Island, lived in the Lower East Side of New York, worked in the garment district for 10 years in sweatshops, and their dream was to open up a grocery store, so they could be self-employed. And as small business entrepreneurs, their goal was to go from being a small business startup serving known customers with known products to feed the family to being a small business. Their exit criteria for entrepreneurs from their startup was that they find a business model. And this business model is pretty simple. Business model of a small business is, are you providing a product or service that somebody needs that you can sell for more money than your expense? I don't think my parents had ever heard the word business model, certainly not in English. And they built this business with an existing team. My mother and my father, when we got old enough to put stuff on the shelf, that's what my sister and I did. If they ever made $1 million in their lives, I'm probably overestimating by $900,000 in their total lifetime. But I grew up thinking my parents were entrepreneurs, that they did startups. And I just want to share with you just an amazing fact that the United States is still a nation of small business entrepreneurs. There are 5.7 million small businesses in this country. Makes up 99.7% of all corporations registered. Small businesses. Employs almost half of all non-governmental U.S. workers. Small businesses are your neighbors. They might be you at some point in your life as consultants, hairdressers, grocery stores, groups of doctors, etc. Now, I point that out because they are entrepreneurs, but they are not the tech entrepreneurs we think about. But hold these guys aside, because they are truly entrepreneurs when you get out of technology clusters. There's another type of entrepreneur that's kind of emerging that still doesn't fit the serious tech side, but is also truly entrepreneurial. And those are social entrepreneurs. They want to solve pressing social problems. They want to start something. They have passion. They have vision, and they either want to do it by making a profitable enterprise or using innovation and new technology to go to some third world country or somewhere in the U.S. and actually make people's lives better. So that's startup class number 2. The third type of startup is in the most unlikely place. Anybody ever work for a large corporation? Whoa. Welcome to Michigan. Silicon Valley again. What's a large corporation? In large companies, about 15 years ago, a professor named Clayton Christensen wrote a book called Innovator's Dilemma. That's another one, if you haven't read, should be on your bookshelf. And it's a couple of brilliant insights, but the most important one is that large companies innovate in 2 ways. One is large companies innovate around their core strengths. We know how to make vehicles with internal combustion engines and sell them through dealerships. And we could make variants on that note 500 different ways. In fact, that was like a typical model here. It did have 500 different ways, but it was, a riff on internal combustion engines. Microsoft, world's best company for making Microsoft Word version 47. Right? You never knew you needed first published notation footnotes, but there they are. Right? A sustaining innovation says companies know how to deal with existing markets and, more importantly, known customers. Great companies you hear get close to their customer. Yes, I know what you want. And so I'm going to start iterating, and if I'm great at that, gee, isn't that an expertise? Google, world's best search company. In Silicon Valley, it was thought of as the most innovative company in the valley until 3.5 years ago. 3.5 years ago, Google was a classic case of somebody who got hit by disruptive innovation. Disruptive innovation is when a large corporation needs to deal with new market, new technology, new customers, new channels. Anybody remember what happened to Google 3.5 years ago? Another startup? Facebook. Facebook entered in an area that Google had no expertise, social networking. And by the way, half of Facebook's employees used to work at Google. That's a great sign of disruption. Your best people are going somewhere else. Disruptive innovation is a real challenge to large corporations because the first time in your corporate life you are faced with being a startup again. All the innovation that used to exist in your large company has long past been beaten out of it. And that's not a negative. It's just the fact that large companies do exceptionally well at executing existing business models. Yet for the first time when you deal with disruption, you have to figure out how to get innovative people, talent, processes, etc. inside. And the way large companies do that are two ways. They could either start innovative divisions and build it themselves, or they could acquire. They could acquire intellectual property, they could acquire talent or product or customers or business or product lines. And thank goodness they do, because half of you are going to be working there. Right? I mean, large companies acquire, that's when we hear about mergers and acquisitions. By the way, there's no merger to it, it's acquisition. But it's the board, right? But that's how large companies traditionally deal with markets or segments or disruption they don't know about. And so I just want to point out, inside of large corporations, you also need to be a startup and entrepreneurial at special times. So that's our third. Our fourth is what I call a scalable startup. A scalable startup, sometimes called a high growth startup, is what Silicon Valley says when they use the word startup. A scalable startup starts with some founders who wake up in the morning and say, we're going to take over the world. And everybody believes them. Come on, you're supposed to laugh. Come on, like nothing serious here. It's fine. Your job is to solve for unknown customers and unknown markets. Your job is to find the business model, find a large total available market, something that can grow to $100 million a year in revenue, and build a large company. Your job is to go from the box on the left to the box on the right. You guys hear me out here? Yeah. No. Yes? Yes? No? No? All right, you guys stay back here. I hate this. All right. By the way, what's interesting about a scalable startup is this. A scalable startup is designed to grow big and typically requires risk capital. What the heck is risk capital? What's risk capital? What is it? Venture capital, right? It's venture capital. It's a different word for venture capital, but it actually embodies something that really doesn't get enough play. How many of you are entrepreneurs in this room? Okay. How many of you are venture capitalists? Come on, you're good at it, right? Get up on them quick! Where are you going? So we celebrate that entrepreneurship is all about the technology entrepreneur. I want to tell you that I used to think that too, and I'm embarrassed to tell you I was wrong. We're only half the story. What makes technology entrepreneurship is two equally insane partners. The technical entrepreneurs and the investors who are willing to watch 95% of their investments fail. Seriously. What other asset class, other than housing, would have those characteristics? And it used to be that wasn't like, a financial class. Yes, let's gamble away the FDIC's net worth. We never used to do that. But this is a truly bizarre group of financial people. Wait a minute, you get better odds at roulette, right? Except they seem to have a great track record in terms of payouts. Entrepreneurship as we know it in the United States obviously wouldn't exist without entrepreneurial risk takers, but I just want to remind all, it wouldn't exist without an equally crazy financial class, just as an aside. So when Silicon Valley says startup, this is what they mean. Now, I used to end these are the types of startups right here, except I had to finally admit that there's one more class of startup, which I just didn't even want to believe existed, but it does. And that's what I'll call the viable startup. And the viable startup is the goal to solve, for a narrow set of cases now, internet and mobile apps. You can sell to a larger company. There is actually VC asset class, like in Silicon Valley, Dave McClure and some of the others, who are going after, you know what, I'm happy to take a $1 billion exit, but I'm even more than happy to kind of invest in a ton of interesting companies for a small amount of money, and I'm just overjoyed to get a $5 to $50 million exit. And I now consider that a class of legal Steve startup, where I will now say, I think we've covered the 5 different types of startups. Why I think it's important is all of you who are entrepreneurs fall somewhere between the scalable and viable class. And that's really interesting, because outside of these clusters, all of you are considered certifiably insane. And I'm going to prove it to you. I'll just prove it to you. One little test. In this room of what, 200 to 300 people, there's at least 2 of you who are going to be worth $100 million in the next 20 years. Probably a couple more are going to be worth $10 million. The rest of you would have been better off working at Walmart. Okay, laugh, but that's not a joke. Good, you missed a few on this one, because the joke really is,
unless you're a woman, right?
that every one of you are feeling sorry for all the other people. So that's how we know that we have a room full of crazy people, right? Where else in the world can not only we do this, but there's a shot at, again, a major payoff here. I love entrepreneurship. And so, once you understand these 5 classes, maybe my definition of what a startup is, because that was the other thing I could never understand. I'd go into every professor's room and kind of ask, what's a startup? And there'd be this Harvard definition of getting resources when you couldn't get them, and these other definitions. And, those were great, but they were kind of dancing around like what it is. So, I kind of decided to define the box on the left. To me, a startup is a temporary organization used to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. And this is worth parsing. One is, the goal, just in case you haven't picked up, is not to stay on the box to the left. Now, for some of you go, oh, yeah, hey, you didn't realize that. Because I used to love being in the box on the left. Parties, your beer, whatever. It was camaraderie. We were in a small building. It was fun. And in fact, I used to hate when it grew. But actually, the point of you and your investors is not to have that close community. Go get some friends instead. Right? I understand it's difficult, but no, that works. Out there, but okay, we've kind of combined those two. But the goal is to become the box on the right. It's a big idea. Temporary organization. And how do you know you exited? Because what you're doing is very interesting. And this is huge, because I don't think we understood this for 40 years. How startups are different from large corporations is what every one of you do better than anybody else, is you know how to search for a business model. Search. Large corporations in their early days had to do that, but now they execute a business model. You hire in large corporations executives competent in execution. In startups, we hire crazy people who are capable of doing something different at 9 a.m. that they are at 10:30, getting on the plane, to Chicago, then flying to campus, and then coming back at home for dinner, and thinking that's a normal day. All the while you're searching for something called a business model, which I'm going to go into some detail later, but it's just the simple way that your company delivers value to customers and gets paid for it. And all the pieces that make that up. Entrepreneurs are spectacular at search. They don't happen to be so good at execution. And now I normally used to change the focus of the presentation here and start going into customer development until I realized there could be some value showing you the secret slide that no VC ever wants you to see, which is what happens to entrepreneurs after you're done searching. So if we really think about it, what happens is startups search, but there's a secret box in the middle called build. That secret box is the transition from an organization designed to search for a business model to one that executes. Searching is a chaotic event. Nothing is certain. Everything's changing. It takes a special breed of entrepreneur to deal with it. And by the way, what I usually do when I have a class, but I won't make you do this here, is I'll observe, and I'll just ask. You don't have to raise your hand, but just look guilty. How many of you come from dysfunctional families? Okay? Yeah, somebody's raising their hand. Everybody else just look guilty. Okay. It turns out that a disproportionate number of successful founders grew up in chaos. They're the survivors of dysfunctional families. To them, a startup, hey, no one's throwing plates or knives. It's a pretty good day. Some of you who grew up in it are going, yeah, what's that doing? It's like, yeah. The rest of you who grew up in a normal household are for the first time in your lives at a disadvantage. Which meant those of you who grew up in a dysfunctional household, actually in the search phase, do much better. Because there's a lot of noise, a lot of stuff coming at you, you go, okay. I know how to deal with this. My whole life was bringing order out of chaos. Just want to observe that because it's an interesting consequence of what do you think happens when the startup is no longer chaotic and now becomes executable. And you have to do the same thing every day. What do you think happens to those CEOs who love chaos? They throw hand grenades into their own company to keep the chaos going. Anybody ever work for a boss like that? Oh man, somebody said, oh, I recognize that better. And somebody going, oh my God, that's me. You should just know that. There's nothing wrong with it. The problem is thinking it's all about you or all about your boss. It's a very common pattern. Entrepreneurs tend to be startup CEOs because they're actually good at it, and they don't understand who they are and why they do these behaviors. But something else interesting happens. Your investors are happy to coach you, the founder, during this search phase. But what you don't really realize, I don't know how many boards do you sit on in Michigan? Do you sit on boards? Right, how many boards? You're VC. No boards?
No.
All right. Typical Silicon Valley VC, 8 to 12 boards. 8 to 12 boards. Now remember they're having board meetings every 4 to 6 weeks. Every 4 to 6 weeks. You're seeing one VC. They're seeing 12 entrepreneurs. So as they drive into the parking lot for your board meeting, they have to look up your name. They even have to look up the name of your company to make sure that they're in the right building. And they're really practiced. They go, hello, Joe. How's the data bin? Oh no, web app. No. Oh, sorry. Got to connect learn to school. I should just kind of shake them and figure out, what kind of talking. And that's just fine. They will provide you coaching. It's not that they'll ignore you and give you bad advice. But at the end of the day, there's no one better to run a company during search. This is a key idea for entrepreneurs. To take a company away from an entrepreneur in the search phase, truly, you have to screw something up really bad. It usually has to involve a daughter or a child of somebody. I mean, it's that bad, right? If you're being removed, then it's like, there's a police report on this. And I only want to just make that point. Is that true? Is that kind of weird? But one day, something will happen. The VC will pull up into your parking lot, open the car door, and kind of go, I smell something. The VC has great pattern recognition. I smell money. And they'll walk into your boardroom, and they know what they're going to see in the first slide. You're going to put up a slide that says, I think we found a repeatable model, or we're going to be profitable. And what you're expecting standing there with that slide is you're like showing them where to pin them out. And in fact, you're expecting them to march you at least up and down the cubicles, throwing confetti, celebrating. That's great news. Instead, for the first time, your VC is staring at you in a way that's making you personally very uncomfortable. Because they're looking at every part of you that you don't want them to stare at. What do you think they're looking at? Any idea? Why are they looking at you? They're looking at you to say, I don't know if they're going to scam. Would I trust my entire liquidity to this chaotic, great entrepreneur? Thank you very much. But excuse me, their business model and mine have now just diverged. VCs, while they could be your friend, are not in charge of being your friend. They have their own business model. And their business model is to take your company to some stage of liquidity. That is, whether it's a merger or acquisition or IPO, and you need to understand that. You can love your VC, you can like them, you can hang out with them, but the day you say profitability, they are now looking at you with very cold eyes. And not because they're being mean or bad or anything else, they are calculating, is your presence in the chief executive operating role decreasing or increasing their odds of being liquid? Make sense? And what typically happens is that the founders depart, and the VCs bring in an operating executive. Somebody who's actually great at the phase of transitioning a company from build to execute. And this isn't malice, this isn't, bad, but by the way, this is the secret slides and the secret memo that creates all these stories about the VC stole my company, or they, replaced me when I was just doing great. Well, yeah, you didn't quite understand that your model was not their model now. Make sense? Right? Might explain, anybody have this happen to them? No? No one yet? Really? Welcome to Michigan. It will. Now, the interesting thing, and somebody will call me on this, so I'll call myself, is that the world's best and most innovative technology companies are still run by their founders. Gee, Steve, can you explain that? Yes, but somebody will have to ask you that question later. So, a few short stories. How did we get there? I always thought entrepreneurship was born fully formed. Turns out, no, we're kind of in the middle of a couple of ways. From 1970 to 1995, the way you made money was by building a business. 1995 to 2000, dot-com boom. 2001 to 2010, you had to build a business again. And I predict there's going to be another short bubble. Again, and let me explain each one of those areas. In the beginning of Silicon Valley, when venture capital became professionalized, they all kind of adopted the limited partnership, 220, blah, blah, blah. About 1978, 1979, pension funds could invest in billions poured into venture capital funds. The way you built a startup was, number one, it took millions of dollars to build a company. You had to buy specialized hardware, workstations, mini computers, specialized software, Oracle with PeopleSoft, etc. Cost you millions just to get the hardware and software needed. You had a long product development cycle. The typical engineering methodology was waterfall. You did a market requirements document, you spent all the features, and maybe 18 months later you had a release, believe it or not. And the typical business was measured in thousands of customers. And the liquidity, the way you and your investors made money, was through an initial public offering. But you just didn't go public. No investment bank would take you public without 5 quarters of increasing revenue and profitability. I know that sounds bizarre, but they actually wanted to see you make money. And what was really interesting is there was no known repeatable methodology for startups. What you heard from your board was great war stories and some sage advice, but really no heuristics. That's what we had 1970 to 1995. And the goal that everybody was focused on, the investors and the CEOs, was long-term success, and VCs and founders were company builders, and the exits were IPOs. And by the way, a successful VC career and a successful founder in 1979 or 80 made $10 million. You were considered rich, right? And there's no zeros missing here, right? That was considered just a hit. And the playbook we used was the business plan. That's what we used. And by the way we thought about introducing products looked like this. Started with a concept, seed round, product development, alpha test, beta test, first customer ship. Anybody see this diagram before? I used to joke that to my classes at Berkeley, even the waiters in San Francisco could draw this until one of my students said, well, we're waiters because we used to be CEOs of .com companies. I promise I never make that joke again. I lied. But actually, this diagram, over time, turned out to be one of the leading causes of startup death. And why is kind of interesting. This diagram, which is truly a clone of what you would do in a large company, has 2 fundamental assumptions. It says, you're the founder, you're assuming you understand the customer problem top to bottom on day one. And because you're passionate and visionary and you understand the problem, the next thing you're going to do is spec every possible feature. Why? I know the problem, therefore, okay guys, let's sit in the room, do some system planning, we'll sketch out the architecture, we'll list all the features. By the way, if we're unclear about all the features, we have a marketing guy, and his job is to go out and copy all the data sheets from all the competitors and do the, like the sum. And that's what marketing was considered, That was advanced marketing, we got data. Trust me, I know that was my job. And at the same time, if you were doing the playbook, you'd hire marketing would kind of create markup materials and positioning while engineering was doing something else. Alpha and beta, you'd hire PR agencies, start early buzz, and marketing would get to do the best job in the company. They'd create demand and have a launch event, right? You'd launch the product and have a brand. You'd hire a sales VP, who'd hire a sales staff, build a sales organization for first customer ship. You'd hire biz dev, I still don't understand what they do. And then you'd hire an engineer who'd write the market requirements document, go with the waterfall model, QA, tech hubs, need a manual, right? The entire spec product. Now, what we found out, luckily, is, and by the way, we just discovered this just as the dot-com bubble started to rise, was that more startups fail from a lack of customers than from product development failure. Now, for those of you engineers in the room, no, I've never seen a product delivered on time. I'm just pointing out that even in Silicon Valley, where there is more technical risk per square inch, the failure mode was not that engineering ever failed, or ever didn't deliver the product. Happened, but happened rarer. The common failure mode is we spent more money than we could make. Yet we had tons of processes to manage product development. But we had absolutely no insight on how to manage customer development. In fact, our best model was, you hire a gray-haired CEO and a gray-haired VP of sales, make sure he or she had a great Rolodex. And that was it. That was our model. And just as we were figuring this out, a guy named Mark Andreessen showed up. And the world changed in August 1995. Do you remember what happened in August 1995? Your parents could tell you. What happened? IPO. Netscape IPO. Nothing wrong with Netscape going public, but what Netscape IPO proved was that there was a public market for stock without profits, and certainly not a relationship to its revenue. And that continued for 5 years. It now took tens of millions of dollars to start a company, not because you needed more hardware and software, but seriously, you needed to hire the advertising and PR agencies to brand the company. These were the people who hopefully have socked it away in Antigua, because like, if we ever catch up to them, I'm going to kill them. It was still a long product development cycle. Netscape actually broke the model and said, yeah, but we could shorten it, not because we understand natural engineering, we'll just ship the data and you can QA it. No, seriously. But for the first time, something fundamentally shifted. This is a huge shift. Startups can now think about millions of customers within a couple of years. Millions of customers are now available over a channel that never even existed, the web. And liquidity here was the IPO, but it wasn't a rational IPO, it was a concept IPO. And the repeatable methodology, we finally had one. It was brand, hype, flip, or go off. And truly, that was the game. The goal was short-term exits, and VCs turned from company builders to engineers of financial transactions. And I'm not saying this is pejorative. I mean, they were doing what was right for their investors. Gee, you had to be dumb. As everybody else was having bags of gold hit him on the head for you not to say, hey, that's a pretty good idea. Where can I stand? Founders hacked their companies, and this was a game of musical chairs. The last one standing, like the CEO of Webman, looked up. The very last one went to jail. That's Frank Montrone. But, everybody else, got absurdly rich. Until March of 2000, and this bubble went away. And the playbook then was the S1, the offering document. Some of you might never have seen this document before, but it was pretty common during the bubble. This was called the Buy the New Mouse document. But for the last 10 years, we had to go back to basics. From 2000 to like 2004, VCs literally picked through the rubble of failed startups. What can I say? There was a game of triage, some are savable, some went through all their cash, some had 800 people when they should have had 80. It was a pretty miserable time for anybody to go through it, except for those of us who were retired. But eventually, what we figured out was what we started to learn at the end of the last wave, was that we now could build a different class of startups. That at least for next generation of web and mobile apps, it was now possible to start a startup. Not completely funded to beginning to end, but at least consider that you didn't need millions. In fact, you wouldn't know what to do with millions. There's a class of startups, not all hardware companies, not clean tech, but a class that almost barely existed before, web apps and mobile apps, that would take $500,000 to start. And this was possible because a set of interesting things. Open source commodity software, commodity hardware, Amazon Web Services. All these things that you used to spend millions of dollars for just now went away. And engineering got smarter. Anybody using Agile development, some XP or Scrum or what? All of a sudden, this idea that I had to spec the entire product and ship it only when every feature was done. We got much smarter and said, we know how to do incremental and iterative development. And those are different forms of what's called agile engineering. And it shortened the product development cycle from years to months, if not weeks, for an initial version. And here's the scary thing. We went from millions of customers to companies having hundreds of millions of customers. We would have thought this was science fiction 10 years ago. Facebook went from 0 to 600 million customers or users in 3.5 years. I predict in 5 years we'll see 10 or 20 more customers who do this. What's interesting is the total available market for web and mobile apps are measured potentially in billions of customers. Billions. Being driven by every smartphone, web app, tablet that's getting out there. And what the other piece that just is amazing is that people have these devices in their hands or their faces almost continually. And so the interaction with applications are now much richer rather than just visiting them once a day. Liquidity in this time for the last 10 years was mostly mergers and acquisitions. Very few IPOs, obviously some exceptions like Google, Salesforce.com, etc. But mostly startups got acquired. And you weren't getting acquired on hype. You had to deliver either revenue or networks of users, that is, scale of a user base. And we started to, for the first time, think about a repeatable methodology, understanding how to actually reduce risk in early stage startups. Just beginning. And that's agile engineering and customer development, which we'll talk about. We also started to understand, and this one is just amazing to me, that what we had been taught for the last 40 years about startups and large companies was just simply wrong. Not just kind of wrong, it was completely wrong. I'm going to just, as an aside, anybody know when the first modern corporation was formed? Anybody? East India Company, anybody remember that from history? About 1600s. Anybody know when the first MBA was issued? You're in the business school, you should know that, right? Probably engraved on the seams. 1908, Harvard, at least in the United States. Anybody know what MBA stands for? Come on, for those of you in business school, raise your hand. What's MBA stand for? Masters of Business Administration. We have 300 years of operating companies without MBAs. Boy, how were we able to do that? But what Harvard truly recognized, just at the beginning of the American century of industrialization, that corporations truly needed professional management. And that no one had put together a curriculum that said, listen, why don't we just teach a standard curriculum on strategy, on human relations, on finance and accounting, that we could actually graduate masters of administration of businesses. And that was cool. But they were not teaching them how to start these businesses. They were teaching them how to administer these businesses. 300 years of practice kind of concatenated into a 2-year MBA. I will observe that startups in its modern form are at best 50 or 60 years old. You could argue whether it goes back to Boston and American Research and Development and Roger Rayle in 1947, or the beginning of the limited partnership in Silicon Valley in the mid-60s, but in any case, 50 or 60 years old. Obviously, entrepreneurs have been innovating since the wheel, but I consider modern entrepreneurship when it became a partner with venture capital. In those 50 or 60 years, we've become complacent in thinking that everything that you learn in an MBA program and all those tools are actually what we ought to be using for a startup when we're searching. I'll observe that that's so backwards, we should feel a little dumb, and let me explain why. So, what startups do is they search and pivot. They're looking for a business model. Startups are on the left. You exit being a startup when you understand customer needs and product features and product market fit, etc. As I mentioned earlier, large companies execute. Become a large company, my arbitrary definition, cash flow, break even, you rapid scale, you have 150 people, you happens to be something called Dunbar's number, look it up, it's a great thing to know. But pick your number, doesn't matter. When the business model is repeatable, you're heading to be a large company, your focus is on execution. Well, okay, Steve, I kind of get there, what's the big deal? Well, I'll give you a couple of examples of the big deal. Accounting. Anybody ever do or have to learn income statements, balance sheets, cash flow? You may have to provide that to your board in a board meeting. I had to do that for 15 years until the light bulb went on that looked like this. Okay. Startup, month to month. Great board meeting. Perfect. Steve, where's your income statement? Oh, here. Good. What does it say? Anybody know what my income statement said month to month? 0. Man, was this formatted great. And the VCs looked at that and said, yeah, look at that formatting. Okay? And the balance sheet, yeah, you still have the same money you have needed. Good, all right. Yeah, good, all right. Yeah. Cash flow, all right. You spent, like, oh, this is M&X, okay. Right? All right, board meeting's over. Next month, I come in. Okay, there's a new column. What does it say? Income statement. 0. All right, board meeting, looks at it, yeah. Columns are aligned, it says, well, this is a joke. I just want to point out that income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow in large corporations are not jokes. Right? They're the minimum of what you need to manage a large distributed organization. Financial accounting is critical. Critical. Those are the metrics you are using at minimum with 5,000 other things you learn in business school. And nobody asks, you need that stuff to learn to run a large corporation. Don't get me wrong. But in a startup, I will contend that if a board member ever asks you for that stack, get up and smack them silly. Right? Because that's for their accounting. Right? You only need a couple numbers to know. What is, how much cash you got in the bank? What's your burn rate? And like, when are you going to hit the ground? And that's actually the math thing. If you're a great entrepreneur, you'll like figure out how to make it last at least a year long, right? You'll like borrow stuff from other people's credit cards. I don't even want to know how you're going to do it. I've done that multiple times. Why did you know you had a line of credit? No, sign here. Wait a minute, that's my personal account. What happened to my jet? It got sold. Well, I don't know, thanks though. But seriously, if you're a startup, the metrics you and your board members in the search phase need to be worrying about are things like these, and these are just examples. If you're in the internet space, you ought to be arguing about what are the right metrics to figure out. Are we searching? Do we understand customer acquisition cost? Do we understand, is this thing viral? Do we understand customer lifetime value? Or whatever your metrics are for the business you've said you're in. It's not about accounting. Accounting, seriously, you need to know 3 numbers. It's about having heated and important discussions about very different numbers that force you to think about, oh yeah, what am I trying to achieve? What are some ways to measure that? And those numbers might change as you learn and as you change your business model. Does that make sense? Just showing up with income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow in a startup now with me is a criminal offense. Not in a large company, but in a startup. Sales. No big difference. Does anybody know how to call a VP of sales of large corporate enterprises? How tall? Yeah, 6'2". Of course. What color is his or her hair? His or her hair? What color? Gray, of course. Comb forward or back? Back. Yeah, we know. Right? Typically a tall, old white guy. Right? And they're not handicapped low digits, except in Michigan when they can't play that for the year. But we'll give them some extra points. We laugh about this, but in a large corporation, that's actually pretty accurate. And those people are incredibly skilled at building sales organizations, at figuring out how to hire salespeople who know how to sell off of price lists and data sheets, and who want to join the top 1% club so they could go to Hawaii or Bermuda or, I don't know, Toronto, wherever you send them here. Windsor, I don't know. And they know how to make a revenue plan. Now, I got to tell you, I've fell victim to this. I would think in an early stage startup, you could hire one of those people? Holy cow. Wow, wouldn't that be awesome? And so I did. I hired a director of sales from Oracle. Senior guy, Harvard educated, brilliant. Brilliant. And I remember, must have been second week, we're making sales calls together, rainy California winter. It rains in the winter. We've just been thrown out of the 4th company in a row. I get in the car, I'm bummed. I mean, I'm just like, and then I turned, looked at Jay, my VP of sales, and he's putting the key in the ignition. I'm, Jay, what are you doing? I said, Steve, we're going to make the next call. I said, Jay, we just got thrown out of 4 companies in a row. Don't you think we should stop and figure out what's wrong? He said, Steve, great salespeople never stop. No. Now, the good news is that's exactly what you want to hear in a large corporation. The bad news is you've just gone out of business if you let that continue in a startup. Big idea. Big idea. In a startup, that's not what you want. Because as we're driving to the next account, Jay sees me typing. I said, what are you writing up? I said, Jay, I'm not writing up anything. I'm changing our entire corporate pitch. And Jay almost drove off the road. He said, you can't do that. I just memorized the old one. I said, Jay, you memorized one that doesn't work. We're going out of business. But it doesn't matter. And then he calmed down. Just as we're getting in, I said, hang on, I have to change this other document. Well, what do you change it? Yeah, our pricing model doesn't work either. I'm changing all the pricing. Oh man, like he almost didn't get out of the car. I almost had to drag him in. I got this. It was like a script, right? To him, it was a script. To me, I was iterating the business model. The point is, world-class people who are great at execution, we make a major mistake in startups. Is the title we use for sales is identical as the title that they use in sales for execution. By the way, think it's only sales? Think about what marketing does in a large corporation. And what his job description is very different in a startup. By the way, in sales in a startup is all about finding early adopters. Pricing and features are unstable, not yet repeatable, all one-offs. This guy had smoke coming out of his ears for about another 3 weeks until we agreed it was a bad hire on both sides. Does this make sense? And anybody ever have this happen to them at all? Whoa. Whoa. So it must just be all your fault, right? It can only be your fault. We've never said that, wait a minute, in search, we need different job descriptions, and we get confused that we use the same title. Eventually, we're going to want, and by the way, sometimes we just say, they were dumb, they didn't get it. No, no, no. They're actually quite competent people. We were dumb because we didn't know when we need that skill set. Make sense? Engineering, same thing. World-class VPs of engineering, large corporations, they know how to write requirements documents, do waterfall development, QA, and tech pubs. I could always tell large company engineering when I say, how many tech pubs people do you have? And if it's more than one, you're in trouble. And I could watch people tweeting or SMSing saying, fire the tech pub. Because in a startup, you want a very different engineering organization. You want somebody doing continuous deployment, continuous learning, self-organizing teams, minimum feature sets, and difference. Does this make sense? Very different skills. And by the way, my favorite is, in large companies, business plans make all kinds of sense. They describe known markets, known customers. You do a revenue plan, that 45-page financial spreadsheet that makes business schools people's eyes glow. Oh, good, I can do the spreadsheet. All makes lots of sense. But in a startup, you actually want to do a business model, not a business plan. And I'll explain the model in a second, but it describes a series of unknowns, not knowns. So, in kind of summary, for the last decade, the IPO market was closed. Mergers and acquisitions were mostly the liquidity path. Companies built for the long term, but they and their investors were pretty reasonable. Somebody made them a good offer, we were out of there. Founders had to learn lean skills, and the focus was building customers and minimum time. And the playbook, 4 steps to the epiphany, bunch of agile engineering tasks. That was about it that we had for kind of literature. Now, the problem was we were still using this, the business plan. Let me list all the things the business plan is good for. Okay, let's move on. The reason why I say that is in a startup. Remember, a business plan is great in a large company. Don't get me wrong. If I'm in business school, you need to learn how to write a business plan. In a startup, this is the leading cause of death. And here's why. No business plan survives first contact with customers. None. None. It's a static document. It's just a series of untested hypotheses. And every time, I used to find ex-students who'd say, Professor Plank, we started our company. What's the problem? Not that I didn't know. Our customers aren't behaving per our plan. I answered, maybe go out and wrap a copy of the plan with each copy of your product. And they'd actually think about that for a minute. Would it fit in the box? Can they do that? That's not the point. The point is, we needed to do something very different, and we didn't know what that different was in startups till now. This is where Alexander Osterwalder's work comes in. We want to search for a business model. Osterwalder kind of nailed it. He said any company could be described in 9 building blocks. They were pretty simple. He said, listen, every business, even though, how many of you are engineers? Even though you think it starts with your product, actually no, it starts with a customer. Right? Who's your customer? And what jobs do they want you to get done for them? Then you get to say, what product are we building? Now, because Osterwalder is European, he loves $50 words, and he calls it value proposition. But, translating that into English is, what product or service are you building, and what are its features? And how does it serve those customers you think you have? How are you going to reach those customers? physical or virtual channel. And within physical or virtual channel, there's a whole set of options. Right? Direct sales, VARs, system integrators on the web, there's an equally set of complex choices. And what kind of relationships are you going to have with them? And that's just also a shorthand for how are you going to acquire, keep, and grow customers. On the web, is it SEO, is it SEM, is it, in the real world, are there retention programs, loyalty programs, ads, trade shows, etc.? And how are you going to make money? What's your revenue model? That's pretty simple. On the left-hand side, there's also some interesting things. Is what are the key resources your company's going to need to win? Is it engineering talent? Manufacturing? And what activities do you need to excel on? Do you need to be SEO and SEM experts because it's all about, click-through? Or is it something else? Do you need partners? Apple with the original iPod would have just been another MP3 player doing, mix, rip, and burn until Steve Jobs used his reality distortion field on every record company to give up their company. Yes, it makes lots of sense to us to give you, Steve, all our money. Yes. Okay. She shows the tiny box again, yes. See this guy blow that little turtleneck? Oh, cool. God knows, some people, like a week later, didn't we have a wallet in your box? It was like, that is a reality distortion field. But you ever want to know what definition is like to give your entire business model to somebody else? That's a reality distortion field. And then, how much does all this stuff on the left now add up? Which are expensive? So if you kind of do all this and actually put it in what I call Canvas, you can download this business model Canvas on the web. It's free, Creative Commons license. You can now sketch out your business model. And this is as far as Alexander Osterwalder took it. Said, hey, it's a nice static document. But you got to realize they're just hypotheses. And because we're in a school today, we allow you to use that fancy word. But when you leave this building, what's the word hypotheses really mean when you hit the street? Guesses, right? They're just guesses. Right? You can tell your parents I learned all about hypotheses. Right? What does that mean? Just effing guess. So the interesting thing is how to start up search for a business model. Okay, we got this thing. It's a nice idea. I could describe a company in 9 boxes. Well, the search happens to be called this process called customer development. The implementation is some form of agile development, agile engineering. The sum is sometimes referred to as the lean starter. I think, are you guys going to have Eric Reeser in a couple weeks or no? You should have it sometime. Now, Eric has been a great proponent of the sum of the two. I want to talk a little bit about the process, the search called customer development. Customer development, one of the key premises of how you search for a business model is you get out of the building. Now, it's not you get out of the building, it's you, the founders, get out of the building. This is a huge idea because it's just contrary to every great development person's instinct, which says, I got the vision, I got it, now leave me alone and let me code the product or build it. That's the leading cause of startup day. Why? Can we run a little exercise? Let's do a little exercise. Assume I'm your VP of sales. And we got this new prototype product. And you send me out to see if anybody likes it. Of course, you know what the answer is going to be. It's going to be wonderful. And I come back and say, boss, I got bad news. No one likes it. What are you going to tell me?
Try harder.
Try harder. Absolutely. First response. Not trying hard enough. Get it back out there. You're just a hire. Obviously didn't do it right. Okay, you salute, maybe you need new shoes, you're the salesperson, etc. You get back out. And you come back again. And you go, I hate to tell you, it ain't working. What do you say?
Go again.
Go again. Again, what do you say?
You're fired.
You're fired. No joke. It's exactly how it works. Exactly how it works. Let's change the scenario. And by the way, you're eating up time and money while that's going on. Let's change it. Somehow, I force you to get out of the building. You, the founder. Stop coding, stop whatever. I don't want you to do this, 24/7, but it's now part of your job spec. Get out of the building, and you now have to talk to customers. Let's pretend I'm a customer. Ask me how the process is. Ask me.
So what do you think? How do you like the product?
I want to give it to the people I meet. What are you thinking when I say that?
Let's talk.
No, you went. What are you really?
You're stupid. You don't understand. Yeah.
You're really interested. If you have any social skills, which I never had, I'd get up and leave and say that, I have an airplane standing outside, I gotta go. But, you might continue, but they don't get it. It's okay, they're idiots. Okay, you go to the next customer, right? Ask them.
So what do you think?
It's probably one of the worst things I've ever seen. What do you think?
Uh-oh.
No, you're not. Really, the reality is, it takes a founder, a competent founder, 3 to 4 times to actually hear it until smoke starts coming out of their ears. That's a competent founder. Usually could have been about 7 to 10 times. But let me tell you, when you hear it, there's no running and hiding. None. You can't blame this on anybody. You can't not deal with this. This is huge. Founders need to get out of the building and test the key components of the business model. And the testing process is called customer development. What we're testing is called the business model. But how we're testing it is this process with 4 steps. And the first 2 are the most relevant here. We're going to do customer discovery, you stop selling, you start listening. You get out and you test your hypotheses with continuous discovery, and it's done by the founders. And we're taking this business model canvas and we're going out and testing every piece of the business model diagram. Now what's very interesting is what we're testing is not the entire product. We're going to build as much as we can, as quick as we can, into something called the minimum viable product. That is, what's the minimum feature set? We can either get an order or a reaction or test or something we set as a goal. I don't want to wait a year and a half. I don't even want to wait 6 months. Get me something up, or get me a phone core model, physical, or get me something I can test, whether it's a biomedical device. I want to be able to test some reaction. In fact, ultimately, I like to get orders. My business model says, sure, just on the paper. And just so you think it's a joke, I sold microprocessors this way. I sold $35 million in microprocessors before we ever did first silicon. When it dawned on me, hey, this is kind of possible. By the way, what you'll find is you need to find a certain set of customers to do that. But the minimum viable product is one of the keys to the early steps. Something else that's key is something called a pivot. Here's something that went on for 40 years. 40 years of venture capital and entrepreneurship. Remember the alpha, beta, first customer ship type of thing? Right? Does everybody remember? You'd have a revenue plan, and after first customer ship, now the partying ended. Okay, you got to meet that spreadsheet. Anybody remember where that spreadsheet got developed? If you ever wrote a business plan, where did it get developed? I'm sorry? At the bar. At the bar. If you were lucky, right? I always thought there was an Easter egg in Excel that I could auto-generate 100 million in 5 years. I still think it's in there. We got to start that rumor, right? We got to say, well, obviously, really, you worked on it? Didn't you use the auto-generation? Isn't that what VCs want to see? It after the auto-generated product. Oh, you didn't hit the web app version. That's 300 million customers in 3.5 years. But what would happen is kind of funny. And this happened with such predictability, I'm stunned that we never recognized it was a pattern, because to entrepreneurs, it was only happening once to us, but shame on the VCs, because the Japanese no play worked like this. You have a launch, first board meeting, VCs would high-five the VP of marketing, the VP of sales, kind of feeling smug, because great pipeline, great demand creation. Next board meeting after that, board would finally get around to go, okay, how are we doing on the plan? VP of sales, almost like clockwork, would say, great pipeline. Okay, great pipeline. Does everybody know what a pipeline is? It's not in order. If I got lots of leads or interest or page clicks or whatever, but nothing really happened. But boy, there's a lot of stuff going on. All right, great, okay, long good enough. Next board meeting. We talk about a lot of stuff, great. How we doing? Blank. Great pipeline. Wonderful, just great pipeline. Now, depending on the economic climate, this either goes on for a year, or it could go on for just 3 or 4 months. Because one day, you open the boardroom door, and I don't know how VCs actually do this, but it happens every time. You walk into the boardroom, and there's a flaming sword hanging from the ceiling over the VP's sales head. And she's not looking too good. In fact, there's actually a stench of death in the room, and no one is sitting next to her. And then literally, when they ask, how are we doing? Puff of smoke and she disappears. It's like a magic trick. Now the joke is, this happens. In every startup, it's very rare that a startup actually makes its plan. But trust me, this creates a crisis. We all run around like we failed and oh my God, we didn't make this plan. We made up in a bar? What were we thinking? Right? We were thinking that a failure was like an exception. Big idea. In a startup, a failure is the norm. Yet we instead made the ability to change our plan dependent on firing somebody. Well, spooky music here. Because we hired a new VP of sales, and if he wasn't stupid, he said, really, what did you do? Oh, of course I was stupid, I'm going to do something else. And they changed what the sales strategy was. Different customer, different product family, different pricing model, etc. They changed. Essentially what they were doing was this feedback loop called the pivot. What I decided to do was say, you know, that's the most wasteful thing we could do in a startup. Why don't we just acknowledge that a startup is about a search, not execution? And why don't we stop firing executives and just recognize that we're going to be doing a ton of experiments. And as long as we keep the cash burn low and don't have VCs vibrating on us all the time, eventually they'll vibrate. I mean, you can't be doing experiments forever, but they'll now understand we're tweaking and learning. Eventually, you're tweaking and learn until you run out of cash. But this is the heart of customer development. It's called a pivot. And by the way, a pivot is kind of defined as when you change one of those 9 boxes substantively, or more than one of the 9 boxes in the business model, you have done a pivot. Now you have a definition. It's iteration without crisis. It's what makes startups fast, agile, and opportunistic. Do we have time for some examples? It's okay? Or, no? You guys bored? Or? Yeah.
Keep going.
So how does this really work? You know, I used to talk about this, blah, 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 I was creating slides, and people said, yeah, but how does it, can you actually make somebody do this in our lifetime? And I said, not only can we do this in our lifetime, I can do this with students in 8 weeks. I'm going to show you results of 3 out of the 9 teams, just random teams. In our launch class, I picked some software and hardware ones just to point out it's not just software people could do this. Teach a class that's never called a Lean Launch Pad. Had a group who said, listen, we want to make essentially Groupon online. We called it rmrayle. I think it's still up and running. Here's our initial hypothesis. So I made each team start with their hypothesis. Just write it down. I don't care whether they're right or wrong. Start with it. Now your job is each week get out of the building and test. First the customers, then the value prop, then the channels, and you will end up changing each one of them. Let's see how these guys tested it. First question was, who are our customers? Do they feel enough value? So they, like great students, said, let's send a fake email to real electronic seller on eBay and ask for quotes. See if we can get any interest. Okay, feeling a little entrepreneurial. And by the way, let's do some interviews. The guy on the phone called Samsung and LG. And let's interview eBay. Let's start a user survey. Figure out what the buyers would want. This is a two-sided market, right? You have sellers and buyers. Multi-sided market, by the way, just as an aside. Used to be big theory, how can I figure that out? Multi-sided market. Anybody know what that is? Right. Multi-sided market, just as an aside. Anybody use Google? You use Google? Okay. How much do you pay? Well, Google's the most profitable company on earth out of search. Aren't you paying $17 billion a year? Well, wait a minute. What do you see when you type google.com? What comes up? And what comes up? Search box. Search box. That's what you see. Empty search box at first. Okay. The product that Google has for you as a user is a search box. You pay 0. Right? And you're as a customer, you're a random searcher USA. Who else is Google's customer? Advertising. What do they see?
AdWords.
What do they see? What do they see is
a dashboard.
Dashboard. Right? They're buying clicks. They have a whole different value proposition. Big idea. multi-sided market. Each side has its own value proposition. Is it the same customers, those doing searches? No, they're different. Different customer segment, they're businesses. Oh, well, wait a minute. So did they get that for free? No, different revenue model too. In a multi-sided market, at least 3 unique things. Unique value prop, unique customer segment, unique revenue model. Some markets have multiple sides. Does that make sense? Using the business model canvas, it's pretty easy now to figure out a multi-sided market. These kids had buyers and sellers. They had buyers, which were people who wanted to buy electronics goods online, sellers, mass merchandisers who wanted to find group buying. So their business model canvas too, here's all the new things they figured out, but then they said, how can we attract buyers? Well, let's test Facebook wall, Google AdWords, or Facebook ads. They got no response on Facebook wall. Turned out Facebook ads was actually more efficient. Business canvas 3. They understood, gee, one of our channels is going to be online advertising. Then they said, how can we attract sellers? Okay, let's do some seller deals. Oops, they failed. Okay, well, should we pivot or not? Because this is now about week 4, and the teaching team is beating these guys up with a stick, which says, you know, guys, this sounded like a good idea. Maybe you ought to pick another one. And like every great entrepreneurial team in any class I've ever had, when I've given them my best sage advice, what do you think they did? They ignored it. Thank you. Oh, you knew the answer. You would ask this anywhere else in the congregation. Well, of course we could have. No, they ignored it because they said we're beaten but not defeated. And so what they thought is, you know, our minimum viable product for the sellers wasn't good enough. So instead of just putting up this page, which we have, which is a dummy page, we're going to spend a week in the middle of graduate school at Stanford and implement the entire seller side for real. And they started coding. And so they coded the home page, they coded the main page, they coded the deal creation page, they coded the Facebook Connect page, and they coded the bidding dialogue. And then they said, we need to get more sellers now to look at these pages. And I said, I wonder how we're going to do that. Until I got an email from the head of IT at Stanford. It says, massive spam campaign coming from one of your class accounts. You know what I told the team? All right. Yeah, well, I'm serious, all right. Cool. What happened? They've got 180 sellers doing 80 deals in the middle of class. And then they got another 200 sellers doing 50 deals. And then their seller said, listen, we need to figure out who's going to pay for this, pay for shipping and sales tax. Oops, we forgot. So, go figure that out. And because we now figured out stuff we didn't have even count in our expense side, now can we make money? So they added, believe it or not, a middle class, nominal sales tax calculator, frequently asked list, and cross-selling options for the sellers, and then said we now need to pump up the buyers again. And so they started see if they could get the buyers going viral, and they started to figure out what their revenue and cost sources were. We made them do some preliminary income calculations, and here was their final canvas. And just to show you what they did, you know, their key lessons, get out of the box, meet customers, flexibility versus determination. Business canvas, week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Using business model diagram, you can now keep score and watch your customer development progress. Make sense? Okay, done for software. Want to see another example? All right. These guys decided they want to be in clean tech. And they said, listen, we know how to build the cheapest, most powerful residential wind turbines ever. I said, residential wind turbines. That might be an oxymoron with an emphasis on the second syllable, but okay. And they said, we're going to sell wind turbines on the right to customer segments, single-family homeowners, faster payback, direct sales. We'll just have to worry about city council regulation. Sure, okay. Yeah, sounds great. Well, these guys, you know, said, okay, it took us about a week. Very bad idea. But we still like the wind turbine idea. Okay, well, what are you going to do with it? And so they started saying, well, maybe we got to go after cities and lighting companies. And maybe we ought to have direct sales to cities, and we're going to retrofit wind turbines in street and highway lines. Oh, that's kind of interesting. So cities retrofit relationships with city engineers and councils, and they need to learn all about the city approval process, which they knew nothing about. And they finally said, hey, is we're going to sell to cities and lease them the system. We'll pay for the lights and the light posts for the cities, because each wind turbine on every lamp will make excess power. And we'll do leasing and a power purchase agreement and direct sales maybe to wind developers. So very quickly, in 8 weeks, this is just a short summary, they went from here to here to here to here to here to here to here. I'm going to show you one last one. It's kind of my favorite. These guys built the carrot box. They did a robotic weeding company. Their original business model said, we want to do John Deere without the driver. We want to make mowers, and you know, our target market, golf courses, and maybe big university greens. That's what we're going to make, and I'm kind of saying, you think John Deere maybe thought of that? No, we really are we're excited, okay? They got out of the building, first week, 20 interviews. Now remember, Silicon Valley doesn't have, they also want to look at weeding, but we don't have any farms. It made it kind of hard. I pointed them to a map of the Central Valley of California and said, farms are over here. Friday, they got in my car, drove 320 miles round trip, 20 interviews, 6 farms. Came back and said, yeah, we think it's, you know, kind of mowing and maybe weeding, and we'll sell to mowing dealers and ag dealers, and we'll just sell them the equipment. But when we came back, we don't think we're doing mowing anymore. We actually think that the business is selling to vegetable growers. And what we could really do is weeding. And why weeding is we could do 100-to-1 labor cost reduction. Huge, because organic and regular vegetable farms needed to be weeded by hand multiple times a year. But they said, you know, people aren't really believing we could recognize weeds in the field. We know we can, but, you know, they go, there's no way a computer is going to recognize, like, weeds, and how are you going to kill them? So they built a carrot box in 1 week. An autonomous vehicle with an image recognition computer that under any lighting conditions could recognize weeds in a field, and they were about to put a DARPA high-power laser in them before I stopped. And I said, you know what? If Fluffy ran in front of this thing, it'd be all over. Like, class would be over, your career would be over, it'd be done. Some of you aren't laughing because you were thinking about that too, right? Instead, they got with UC Davis, which is kind of a University of California school, and figured out that someone else had worked on how do you kill weeds from a vehicle, and discovered that hot oil shot through a stream actually was quite effective in doing that. So they put the image recognition in a hot oil squirter, and they got it out of the building again with a carrot box, and they updated their business model, and they realized it's organic farmers, and they still thought it was a direct sale, and it still was labor force, but now they started realizing that maybe we might want to rent the equipment rather than sell it. But we still have some issues about, can the technology really work, and how can we deal with IP and patents? And while this is going on, the World Ag Expo, really seriously, happened in California. And they not only got to interview more customers, they found a competitor called RoboCrop. And they were actually blown away, because I told them signs of a competitor are actually good. You're the first in the market. You know, the phrase pioneers are the ones with arrows in their back actually applies. You don't want to be in the newest market because you have to do all the convincing. Let some other guy do the convincing. And these guys were selling a crude competitor, as they called it, crude competitor, $171,000 direct sales. So what they realized was, no, we kind of have a marketing demo. We kind of cleared up the IP stuff. We still have some questions about key partners and what's our value. And finally, they figured it out. They were going to build this thing, but they weren't going to sell it or release it. What they found out is people jumped over the fence when they said, we're charging by acre with a modifier according to weed density. And every farmer said, boy, you stick that out in our field, you got a free trial, and I'll pay you at the end of the day if this thing works. By the way, they got funded before the class ended. So I just wanted to show you, those were a couple of examples of when I talk about customer development and business model design, these guys are dumber than you, right? Everybody in this room is smarter. Come on, you guys. We're not Stanford students, for God's sake. Yeah, we got lots of time here, this is the thing, right? We got plenty of time. We don't go anywhere. We have plenty of, we can outthink these guys anytime. So what I'm showing you are what students can do. Now, I gotta tell you, these are pretty dense slides, and I concatenated a bunch of them. These are student teams in 8 weeks, and they're carrying a full class load at the same time. I actually beat them with a stick pretty hard, but you know. So I just want to close with a couple of thoughts if the bubble hits Michigan. We're in a bubble, I believe. The rules are different in 2011 than 2006. I believe this is a year we'll start seeing IPOs again. And the things in the pipeline that we'll see, so these IPOs will be real. Facebook, you know, Twitter, etc. But like all bubbles, we'll run out of great things in the pipeline, and not so great things will appear, and the bubble will peter out at the end. Hopefully it'll just peter out. But the thing for entrepreneurs, which I now suggest, which I never did before, is you can actually start thinking about how to target acquirers. Target as a strategy. You can engineer for an acquisition. And I don't mean hype or I don't mean, but you could actually think about this, because if it gets frothy in the IPO market, there's other people who are going to be thinking about acquiring. So the new bubble, still short product development cycle, customers in tens of hundreds of millions, liquidity through M&A and IPO now, repeatable methodology, you can target acquirers. I think you can engineer financial transactions. They're not BS transactions. You have to bring real revenue or accretive users to these games. You still require agile development, customer development, and business model design. But now you add, if there is a new bubble, adoption, order of battle, and visibility. Let me explain these 3 things. Here's the playbook for 2011 and 2014. Lean and pivots are the minimum entry. You need to be lean, you need to be fast, you need to be doing continuous customer discovery and extreme agile development, but you just need to think this through. Every market you're in is a finite number of acquirers. I always love to describe these as spreadsheet problems. They don't require a database. You could list who potentially could buy us. And inside each of those companies are a finite number of deal makers. They have names, they have phone numbers, they have email addresses. Your job is to figure out who they are, what their names are. And they're looking to fill a specific set of product and market holes. This really isn't like science. And they go to a finite number of blogs and conferences and trade shows. You need to figure out what they are. This isn't a 4-month exercise. This could be done in a week or so. This is not, as I say, an MP complete problem. For those who are not in computer science, lean over and ask what it meant. And for adoption, the goal now is to get wide adoption. For massive distribution, and I'll contend that this game now is monetized later. Try to get large networks of users. Can only be done with lean and requires pivots. And the last part is visibility. This is the part that I used to tell startups to go away from. Don't hire PR, don't hire your company, etc. If there's a bubble, acquirers are not going to acquire 10 people in the same niche. They're going to acquire the most visible and actually real company that is visible. Would be worse if you were the real company who was invisible. Then you should feel like an idiot. Big idea. If there's an acquisition frenzy or at least froth, you need to be known as the leader in the market. Unlike the last bubble where you could say that and BS it, this is not BS. But if you are the leader in the market, it now matters whether people know who you are. This is a big idea. Look larger than life, conferences, blogs, social networks, and for the first time in 10 years, I can actually utter this phrase without choking. That PR, and I don't mean expensive agencies, etc., but communicating who you are and why you are the leader in that segment to the right people now becomes kind of important as valuations and acquisitions start to happen. So that's it. Closing thoughts. At the beginning of another tech bubble, rules for making money are different. Founders and VCs can engineer transactions, still require agile customer development and business models, and add these 3 things. So thank you very much, and I appreciate it. So you're all free to to go. All right, what?
We have time for some questions if you.
You do? Really?
Yeah.
No, okay. They're shutting out the lights, huh? Happy to take questions. Really?
That last couple of slides, isn't that just leading to feeding the bubble to create more of a frenzy, which is going to build us up even more and make it crash harder?
You know, absolutely. So you could be the one to worry about the American economy and not get acquired. No, I'm serious. So, yes, right? And by the way, you should ask your investors whether they, first of all, don't believe me. Ask your investors whether this is true or not, right? So I gave you my opinion. First of all, the first thing that you need to do if you have taken anybody's money is say, hey, Steve showed these slides. What do you think? And they go, forget the last 5 slides. Everything else was great. Right? Or they could say, forget all the slides. None of it was true. But first of all, you and your investors need to be aligned. The reason I wrote these decks, believe it or not, is that the investors in the Valley are getting this, and they're forgetting to tell their entrepreneurs. Oops. Because the worst thing you want is your investors smelling an exit and not telling the companies that we're thinking about flipping this deal. And so you want to be aligned. It's a great conversation to have. It's an open and honest conversation. What do you think the exit is? Listen, don't worry about it. Just build the company for the next 3 years. Great. I won't hire a PR. I won't do anything. Don't worry about it. Great. Oh no, we think this thing is getting frothy. You know, you guys really ought to at least be visible on that list of any acquirer. It's a great conversation to have. Fair? Or no?
Absolutely.
All right. Does that answer your question? And yeah, is it adding to the froth? Of course. Of course. Remember, when you take, just as an aside, when you take money from an investor, you're no longer pure. Your goals and theirs have become aligned whether you want to or not. You are no longer building, ladies and gentlemen, a company for you to run for the next 25 years. Big idea. You have made a pact whether you realize what you did or not. Your interests are now aligned with their liquidity goals, and unless you understand that, you are going to be immensely disappointed and confused when they start giving you advice, which you may not like. Does that help? And it's not a criticism of venture. It's in fact a realization, and as entrepreneurs, I think we've been way too dumb about what their interests are and what ours are. And when we're dumb, we don't have the open and honest conversations that we need to have often. Yes?
Along with investment, what are the pros and cons of crowdfunding?
I'm sorry?
Crowdfunding.
Crowdfunding?
What's your thoughts on that?
Sure. Yes. I mean, listen, all my companies were venture funded as an entrepreneur. But I don't want to point out, I want to make it clear that there's multiple schools of thought about whether, VC funding is like the kiss of death from the devil, which is one school of thought. One could make a good case of that. And another school of thought, which I kind of tend to lean to, is if you get the right investors, you're not just getting dumb money. You're getting great pattern recognition. Big idea. If VCs are on 12 boards personally, or they do 30 or 40 or 50 investments or more during their lifetime, they've seen more startups than you're ever going to see. And much like going to a shrink, you think a shrink actually knows something about you? They're great at pattern recognition. They got a manual that says, oh yeah, look, here's what happens. Great investors at minimum have great pattern recognition skills. World-class investors not only have great pattern recognition skills, but they understand your psychology, your company, your space, etc. That's the trade-off between getting what I call dumb money, crowdsourced money, or friends and family money, or whatever, and getting smart VCs. There are smart VCs in Michigan. Some of them are sitting here in this room. In fact, if you're lucky enough to get their check, they will add a ton of value in exchange for taking a piece of your ownership. That's the ultimate perfect contract. Does that make sense? So it's not like, should I take one or another? It's like, what do I get in exchange for each one of them? Other questions? Over there. Who asked a better question? Now, both of you ought to answer immediately. All right, hit him first. Never do that again.
So you said that a lot of times startup founders aren't good at executing the business model, but in some cases, like the very top companies.
You bet.
Yeah, can you explain more about that?
Yeah, that used to puzzle me, and anytime someone would ask that, I'd say, time to go. Turns out, really think about this. Steve Jobs, Larry Ellison, Reed Hastings at Netflix, Larry Ellison at Oracle, Jeff Bezos at Amazon. Some of the most continually innovative companies in the tech industry. Right? It's a continuous innovation cycle there. And these were the founders, day one. How the heck did they do that? Bill Gates, when he was running Microsoft, before it turned into God knows what, when Ballmer took it over. Or another big whatever company. You know, one of those things that don't know they're dead because they still have a continuing revenue.
How do you really feel?
But let me tell you how I really feel about Microsoft. No, in fact, Microsoft is a great case study. This was the most aggressive company on the planet. Anybody competed with these guys in the 1980s? You left with your head literally cut off, thinking you were still walking, and it falls off. That's how it was dealing with Bill Gates. Now it's like dealing with like your grandmother. You know, it's like embarrassing. Oh, we run circles around them, we kick them in the butt. I mean, it's like so embarrassing. And this was a killer company. It actually is a great example of what happens when the founder checks out. So what happens to people like Jobs? You know, people used to say Steve Jobs, he sits in a lead-lined room and just rays of inspiration. And he comes up with these new products. And I used to believe that, you know, Kool-Aid as well. Until a couple of hints that I don't think anybody in the press has picked up on. When Steve Jobs was healthy, he used to answer customers' emails. Did anybody ever read into any of the blogosphere about Jobs? Do you think he only answered those 2 emails a week? Or do you think he only read those 2? This guy is reading every customer email you addressed to him. Every one of them. Now, by the way, I live in Palo Alto. I've seen him in the Apple store, watching customers. You think Steve Jobs couldn't get a computer delivered to his house? This guy is watching customers. My best friend was his VP of engineering for 13 years. He said every time my friend John would come back from a visit of peripheral suppliers around the world, Jobs needed to be briefed in detail about what he found, what's going on, what are the trends, etc. This guy was a founder with his fingers on the pulse of customers and technology and innovation, and he was not the HR manager of the company. He was the innovation manager. And you look at how Ellison works, and you look at how all these other guys work. They owned innovation, but they hired world-class execution people. Phil Schiller, Jonathan Ives, etc. I forget the COO, Cook or Tim Cook. World-class. But what these guys are executors. Steve Ballmer, world-class executor. When the visionary leaves, you have a real problem because the body will keep moving, but there's no head. There's nothing magic about life cycles of companies. Right? There's no guarantee that they'll continue for hundreds of years. It's very hard to keep innovation as continuous revolution when the founders go. Best U.S. examples, GE. Used to be 3M. I don't know, anybody around here. It used to be some people in Detroit, not anymore, but it will again. Does that make sense for that answer? Somebody had a comment or questions on that?
Would you talk about the Scully moment at Apple?
What about the Scully moment? What happened or why you did that?
I don't know. Why Steve seemed to want that to happen.
Sure. If you're a founder and you're in your 20s and your company has grown to an unimaginable size, you're now faced with dealing with stuff that you've never seen, heard of, and never ran into before. How do I deal with hiring 3,000 people? What's a P&L? What's a whatever? Gee, I was making insanely good products, and what's marketing? I just used to show up in my turtleneck and everybody would cheer, but sales aren't. The first year of Macintosh sales, 1985, disaster. Disaster. He almost lost the company in that year. They had to lay people off. So all of a sudden, if you're a young founder, your board could say, you really need an operating executive. It worked. It worked until Jobs went, wait a minute, I didn't need an operating executive. And spent, 40 years in the desert before he came back and took over his company as a much more wiser and experienced guy. So it's not clear if he would have won the battle with Scully at Apple, whether he wouldn't have cratered the company on the way of learning. Does that make sense? He cratered next and managed to get out of it, but he essentially cratered the company. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yes?
What do you feel the relevance of an MBA is for entrepreneurs?
Ringer in the room. So listen, I'm dead honest. I teach MBAs at Berkeley and Columbia. So it depends on what the curriculum is. I will contend that most traditional business school curriculums are taught about how to execute existing businesses, right? You take, HR and strategy and the case studies and, I teach the case studies. I just teach them backwards as how to screw that company in the case study. But they all start with so-and-so sitting by the window and pondering or taking a walk and thinking of the dilemma, and it's always some big company dilemma. The other problem that compounds this, first of all, you've got to believe. Got to believe, or everything I'm saying won't resonate to a business school person. You got to believe there are those 5 types of startups, right? Large companies, scalable, etc. You also got to believe a second supposition I have, which is that startups are about search in the first couple of years, and large companies are about execution. If you don't believe that, everything else I'm going to say is just BS. Are you a business school professor?
Heck no.
Okay. If anybody's here, don't raise your hand, because I'm going to say something, I don't mean it meanly, I'm just as a fact. Most business school professors consult. What size company do you think they consult for? Large companies. Even in Silicon Valley, large companies write big checks. Startups don't have lots of big checks. They might have some equity, but gee, you got bills to pay. And so, therefore, your expertise in a business school is consulting for large companies. So it's just like normal that you would think, yeah, these startups, they're just small versions here. And to have a really tough conversation of, no, your knowledge base is not relevant. It's like a divide by zero problem to a business school professor who believes any business problem is relevant. I'm just contending that these are essentially corner cases that fall out of their expertise. And that there isn't a body of knowledge yet that's been developed, because we've just been developing in the last couple of years, so it's also new. Does this help? So what does this mean for an MBA? If you take a traditional business school degree with a traditional business school curriculum, and you show up in the first year of a startup, you're going to get your butt kicked or crater the company. One of the two. One of the two. You're useless with a traditional curriculum. I don't mean you're useless, but your knowledge, just like that VP of sales or that VP of engineering. If you take some entrepreneurial curriculum, either in the engineering school here at U of M or in other places that teach, what to do in search, you could be very useful. In fact, you could be one of the most useful people there. But you need to deeply understand the distinction of how you would act as a business manager in search versus a business manager as an operating executive. Does that help? And I think it's self-consistent. We could argue whether it's right, but it starts with a set of premises that kind of filter down, and all the way in the back.
So building on that question, so the examples that you showed in your case studies were all from your engineering class?
Yes.
How would you adapt that, or could you even adapt that to a business school environment?
So a quarter of those students came from the Stanford Business School. So I allowed them to join the teams. Well, with the one condition, they couldn't run the teams. The head of the teams had to be an engineer. And 2 is, in the fall, I'm teaching the exact same class at Berkeley, Columbia, and then the Berkeley program in the business school. Identical class. Very easy. I'd be happy to share it with anybody here who wants to do it. So, yeah, just send me an email. Curriculum is online, by the way, and I'm writing a series on my blog. I'm on this will be week 4, describing a couple of these teams, and they're reprinted in serial form in the Huffington Post. Any questions? Anybody on this side? Right this side, don't have any questions. Yes?
What would you say to someone, a friend of mine, let's say, that...
Sitting in the front row, Yeah, I know that one.
That's, someone's gone through customer validation, and the result is identifying 4 different valid business models.
Yeah, cool. Nice problem with that.
What to do?
Right.
Run after them all?
Well, no.
Pick one.
So actually there's, and I'm going to just digress about 2 levels deep and then I'll pop back up if I can remember. The first book I read that actually made me think there might be a pattern to entrepreneurship is still one worth reading again. And that's Jeff Moore's Crossing the Chasm. It was the first book written about entrepreneurship that went, whoa, that describes just what I went through. And what he just described is the problem you have, which is, okay, I actually did this stuff and I got 4 people raising their hand. How do I figure out how to do that? Shorthand to more is you need to pick one, make a beachhead. Okay? And how to pick one, it's in that book. Okay? It truly is in that book. But I will tell you something else this brings up. And by the way, anybody who wants to go, feel free. I won't be insulted much. For years, I was asked as an ex-practicing entrepreneur by my friends, Steve, how can you teach entrepreneurship? It's unteachable. Unteachable. You know, I love these questions because they bothered me for years. I can't answer them, but my God, I knew I was right. It's only in the last couple months that I realized I was searching in the wrong place for the answer. Think about this for a second. We've been teaching music and art and sculpture for hundreds of thousands of years. And in fact, if you think about music, there are 2 types of creatives in music. There's the composer, who hears something that no one else hears. No one else. And they take a blank sheet of paper and they write out a score. They could hear it and write it. No music, they could hear it. I don't know how they do it. But to make that work, they need, for the first time, to gather a world-class set of performers, first violinists, etc., who could take that score and they say, holy cow, this is going to sound great, and they practice together. Or, imagine a sculptor. The guy's name is Michelangelo, who looks at a block of marble, about 11 feet tall, 4 feet wide, and says, here's the Pieta in there. I just need to remove the stone around it. You and I would say, what are you talking about? It's a block of stone. They go, no, no, no. There's a sculpture in there. I'm just removing the stone. Or an artist who sees a blank canvas and says, it's Starry Night. Founders are the artists, founders, who see the blank canvas and see something that no one else could see. And once they see it, they could describe it to a group of people around them, a core set, who say, yeah, I never saw that before until you started describing it. I'm going to follow you, and we're going to do this. That's the first entrepreneurial hires. It's the founders who do the blank canvas, and the first hires who see it with them are the entrepreneurial founders. Now, in school, we teach music appreciation and art appreciation across entire curriculums when we had the budget, right? Before we decide, nah, that's not important. Right? Great society could afford to do that. I will contend that entrepreneurial survey classes need to be taught in all schools, just like that. Think of it as music appreciation. Even if you go to work in a large company, your peers who have no idea what you're doing, the 21st century will be an entrepreneurial century. We ought to teach entrepreneurial appreciation like we teach music appreciation. But just like we teach music theory, we ought to teach entrepreneurial theory, customer development, agile engineering, how to do Python or, Ruby on Rails. I mean, serious theory. But we also need to, just like music or art, tons of practice. This Lean Startup class is another set of hands-on, intensive practice. Hundreds of hours of practice in this class. And so I believe if you think of that hierarchy of music appreciation, music theory, intensive practice, we can teach entrepreneurship the way we think of art. And I don't think that metaphor has been used too often, and I think it kind of fits. And I have no idea what your question was anymore, but it was a pretty cool answer. Was it a cool answer? Come on. I had to get that in somewhere. Now, you got to know I paid him $20 to ask the question I wasn't going to answer. Yeah. So moving right along.
Business plan competitions
yes,
are still quite popular.
Yes.
What would you recommend?
So's heroin, but like, because we pay a lot of money for idiots to go compete. So I got to tell you, I have a pat answer. I said business plan competition. They're leaving completely because they got to go finish their business plan competition. Go, get ready. When I have ex-students who come in and ask me their advice on business plan competitions, I physically throw them out of my office. Physically. Listen, because my offer is, Why are you doing this? If it's for the money, here's a check. Here's a check. I want a piece of your company. But if you're going to tell me you think the best use of your time is to spend 6 months shuffling paper rather than getting out of the building and starting your effing company, what are you thinking? You're not an entrepreneur. You're a hooker. Now, the reason why we have business plan competitions is if you think about who puts them on, typically they start in business schools, right? The first one started at Rice. Well, guess what? If you're not an entrepreneur, but you're a great business school professor, hey, how long is that paragraph? Was it formatted correctly? Did the revenue model, go nicely from year 1 to 5? Did it analyze that market perfectly? That's known as polishing the turd. I mean, it doesn't get any better. And listen, it's not like I dislike them. But as I said, business plans have their place. I never believed that, but I really do understand that now. In a large corporation, just like you can't get away with not knowing balance sheets, income statements, cash flows, large corporation, of God's sake, of course we need a business plan. But in a startup, you're spending your time doing what? And I think we've just perverted the system by dangling money at the end. True entrepreneurs will go, screw that. I don't need that money. What I need is to get out of the building and actually get some customers. Does that make sense? I don't know if you can answer your question. But
what would you replace them with?
Business model competition.
Right.
First one is was held this year in Brigham Young University. Alexander Osterwalder and I were judges. We had 60 entrants in the first year. I think every university needs to replace them. If you weren't BSing and there wasn't a pile of money, like incenting you to do what I think are unnatural acts. The natural act, think about it. If we held a business model competition where we actually judged you on how many pivots did you do or how valuable was your learning, now everything you were doing was actually in line with what you need to learn outside the building. I'm not really objecting to the plan stuff. I'm objecting to entrepreneurs. Your heart has so many beats. So many beats. Why are you wasting it on a digression? Gee, if I could get you to start doing things in a competition that gets you in the right direction, I'm happy for you to spend your time in a competition that has you learning something. Even if you lose, you win. Does that make sense? In a business plan competition, if you lose, you really lose. You didn't even get the damn money. Does that help?
I read your blog. I just stated.
Yeah. Did I pick it up? Yes.
Yeah, I've got a little bit different type of question for you.
Yes, sir.
I'm saying this is a lifelong resident of Michigan.
Yes.
The last 10 or 11 years, we've been kind of like the poster boy for what to do wrong and keep getting kicked. We've got a new governor. He's a former venture capitalist, former CEO of Gateway. If you were to give him 3 things that he should do in the next 4 years that would encourage entrepreneurial businesses in Michigan, they say they're looking for doing that. What would those 3 things be?
With all due respect, there's only one I would do. And remember, I'm just visiting. So really, this is just a couple of days of observation. I think in the last couple of years, particularly in the engineering school at Stanford, you got a dean who's been an entrepreneur. You now got a world-class associate dean that understands entrepreneurial education. And again, this is not that anybody outside of U of M is doing anything wrong, but there isn't enough density here. Silicon Valley is a company town. Right? It's a company town with only one industry, which is entrepreneurship. You throw a stick, you hit 4 entrepreneurs, 3 VCs, and you're lucky you'll hit a couple of lawyers and they won't get up. Right? But Detroit used to be the same way, right? A couple of machinists, a couple of whatever, a couple of union guys, they'll throw the stick and beat you to death with it. But I mean, you knew what town you were in, right? The definition of a cluster or a company town is that it has infrastructure and expertise in a particular domain that's deep. You don't have to go look for a lawyer who knows what a Series A is in Silicon Valley, right? The barista knows what a Series A does. Right? Here, you got to go, a specialized lawyer, or leasing a building, right? They don't ask you for your blood type, your passport, or whatever. They go, great, how much equity can I have? Right? So that's why I mean is different. But I think those are secondary. I think what this area is missing, with all, and I mean this nicely to the VCs that exist here, is the density that's missing is venture capital density in a variety of areas. I think you got some good biotech stuff, but I think you need to kick it up by a factor of 5 or 10 in IT, web apps, phone apps, etc. You need a couple of VCs like Dave McClure, who knows how to spray and spray. You should have one of those here who's crazy enough to, be writing $250,000 checks, funding everybody who comes out of a business model competition, sight unseen. You should have a couple focused on X or Y or Z. I think you should be supporting 10 VC. I just picked that number. But I mean, the density here is so low, and I don't mean VCs who are fat and comfortable. I mean, they should be standing in your classes trying to steal world-class students. And when I ask engineering deans, do you have problems throwing VCs out of the building? And they go, what did you say? I got to throw them out of my classes at Stanford. In fact, that's how I have them teaching my classes with me, because they get first looks. It's just way too laissez-faire and dialed back here. And the good news is, you got the entrepreneurship stuff. This thing feels like it's the right trajectory. The problem is you're on the flyover trajectory from, California to New York. And I think this is fixable by a governor who gets it. There's a lot of family money sitting around southeast Detroit. Somebody needs to say, hey, your grandson, didn't they graduate with a business school degree? Why don't you give him $10 million? You need to be setting up a pile of VCs. Some of them will blow the money in like 2 years. It's okay. It's okay for you guys, right? Thanks a lot. But some of them will figure it out when they're down to the last million, sucked into a pop. Does that make it? So I would only do one thing. I would figure out, and this, by the way, if you haven't seen it or you haven't read it, there's a great book that describes how Silicon Valley started, and it's called Regional Advantage by a woman named Anna Lee Saxenian, professor at Berkeley. It's an easy, quick read, and it'll blow your mind. All right, we need to go. One more question. The second thing you should look is the one piece she missed, which is a YouTube talk called The Secret History of Silicon Valley. Anybody see it? 250,000 downloads. It's my talk, but it's about the stuff that most people in the Valley don't know about how Silicon Valley actually got funded. So the answer I would say is VC density, and what comes with it is the expertise of coaching and mentoring companies. That is just way too thin here. Last question. Who has the best question? No, the best. Best. Yes.
You talked about Jason. Can you talk a little bit about your response to what Jason Fried talks about in terms of focusing entirely on bootstrapping companies? What is your opinion of that?
Entirely on bootstrapping companies?
He says that he only bootstraps. He rejects all VC funding whatsoever.
He got VC funding from Amazon.
Yeah, so one of the nice things if you're an entrepreneur, and I will make this the last question, but it's kind of funny. We've come full circle. I left Michigan in 1978. I thought I had a job offer from a company in Sunnyvale. Drove across the country, packed up an entire apartment, sold everything, managed to raise $200 for gas, pulled into my new company, showed up in HR, and was told, oh, the guy who hired you, we fired him. He wasn't authorized to hire anybody. And I'm going, what the fuck? Welcome to Silicon Valley. This is how my career started. And I was hired as a lab technician. And I went, what? And they said, yeah, we didn't need any lab technicians. We need training instructors. My career started when I said, why am I a training instructor? And the HR woman said, no way. I said, yeah, absolutely. She said, well, let me introduce you to the head of the department, who was clearly freaking out. They had to deliver a 10-week course to the Army Security Agency, had 6 weeks to go. Guy takes one look at me and says, you're not a training instructor, are you? I said, how quick do you need one? He said, you're hired. I got fired and hired and promoted in the same time. That was the beginning of my career as an entrepreneur. But let me answer your question, which actually was going to be, listen, in 1978, when I started as an entrepreneur, it was so sparse to figure out any heuristics, any advice at all. There was no internet, there were no newspapers, you couldn't get any information. Nowadays, you guys are inundated with just a multiple set of opinions. They all can't be right. And so your job of entrepreneurs today are actually quite different. You need to sort out from all this advice what's right for you. There is no, for Jason Fried, that's right for him. If the guy wants to crowdsource, that might be okay for you. you need to understand, why do people have these multiple opinions? If you blindly follow one or the other because their blog font looks nicer, you're screwed. No, you need to develop some profound beliefs about you and entrepreneurship and who you know and what you like and what feels good for you, and make it a considered choice. Does that make sense? I really appreciate being here, so thank you very much.
We're just doing, we got some